Good afternoon, wherever you are, hello. Welcome to this excellent, awesome webinar where we're going to be exploring some really interesting opportunities and challenges with using historical Twitter data to make better decisions. So we've all experienced hindsight in life. It's not always the best feeling. What we want to do is turn that on its head with this discussion, and with our fantastic speakers explore how we can use hindsight to do a better job in the future. And we'll be looking at some use cases, some best practices and handy tips on using historical Twitter data. We'll start with a couple of presentations just to get us all warmed up, and then we're going to move into a panel discussion format where we'd love your questions and feedback. So let me introduce the speakers today. We have Phil Cam here from Text 100, where he's the VP of Data and Analytics. Phil's very experienced in using social data and historical data with live clients in his everyday workday. We have Nate Walton, who's the Director of Professional Services here at Brandwatch and a big favorite with our customers, who's kind of known for his ability to blend deep analysis and then make it customer facing and tell kind of powerful stories from that data. And we're delighted to also have Scott Hendrickson joining us from Twitter. Scott is a data scientist and at GNIP has really pushed the boundaries of what we can do with real-time and historical data. So a really interesting blend. If we move on, what I will be taking you through is a presentation from Nate and from Scott, followed by a panel discussion with all three of the guys. And then we will finish with a Q&A, and we'd really love your questions. So please feel free to use the hashtag or at us on Twitter, and the team here will be paying careful attention and will reply to as many as possible. So please do get involved. So I'd like to hand over to the fantastic Nate Walton, a big fan of small batch bourbon and a smart guy who's going to take us through some of the use cases and ideas that he's experienced. Nate, over to you.
Thanks, Will. So hi all, Nate here. I just wanted to do a couple of quick slides. Obviously Twitter Historic and this Hindsight tool is going to be pretty amazing from the perspective of all kinds of different data analysis. I just wanted to pull a couple things out and we'll look at them, and then we can, obviously chat about them later. So without further ado. So the thing that got us really excited right up front was I remember we were looking at a couple of different events that happened this year, and we were realizing all of a sudden with hindsight that, or with a greater amount of historical data, that we could in fact go back and look at the really big stuff that's happened more than once. So we have a couple of things that have happened. I mean, that are really big events like the presidential election, obviously the Olympics, and then we just had a World Cup. These things are, I mean, Twitter is not, at this point, as getting reasonably old in terms of a social network, and so you have many years of data. But when you look at the time scale of sort of real life versus social media, you actually sometimes only have had one or two of these huge world events inside of the Twitter timeline. And so just being able to go back all the way is going to be pretty amazing. I've got a handy chart down there with fake data in it, but it's basically illustrative of the idea that there's just so much incremental value in even getting even one more instance of these things that's happening. I mean, if you get a trend and that's happened once around a particular event, and you just go, oh, I wonder if it's happened more than once in the past. If you can even confirm it a second time, you start asking yourself that critical question, which is, when the third time it rolls around, are things about to get interesting? So I don't know if this is a bit more bold than it needs to be, but basically I think also this is really fascinating from the perspective of, this is probably the best picture we have of a social network's growth. That is in two ways. One is we have the data, and the other one is that the data is accessible, because very often actually getting to data this scale can be extraordinarily miserable. There's a recent article about how data scientists actually like to jokingly refer to them as data janitors sometimes, and that can be very true. So I think this is really fascinating about this, looking at this historical data as well. And there's some really practical applications. So one of them is definitely from a marketing or an analysis perspective. If you look at the chart on the right, which they just dated my slides so you can see when I finally put them together. But but at 10:30 this morning, this is the conversation. I just pulled 1,000 tweets about Obama and graphed them, and you can see that those one-to-one connections are really critical sometimes. That group in the middle with the dark blue dots, that's the White House and the Barack Obama Twitter handle talking to each other. And without even a single Twitter comment back and forth. I mean, if we sampled this and got that information back, we may miss critical connections between influential people, and we can't really back into that except by just trying to get all of it. So it's really those individual connections, and from a marketing perspective, those point-to-point conversations are also really critical. So it's not about just the sort of ivory tower, can you build a pretty picture kind of thing. You've got to get all of it. And that's really, really important here. And then the last point about this best picture stuff, which I think is really fascinating, and this is something that we were doing on a project, is if you go back in time, if you go back far enough, there's a time before anybody was on Twitter. And that sounds ridiculous to say, but with New York Times and like Lady Gaga now being sort of fixtures of Twitter, can we go back and look and see if there was a moment when that new network was worth our time? And at some point, I think in March 2007, the New York Times made the judgment that yes, in fact, it was worth their time to be on Twitter. And could we use that at a high level? A big question is always, like with emerging technologies, especially on the web, should the investment be made? And I don't know if we could do anything predictive with this data, but it's definitely intriguing. So the last thing, which is kind of just down nitty gritty in terms of measuring influence, I think is something that people are always really interested in. And there are just kind of two interesting things that cropped up. And actually this came internally from a suggestion from the marketing team, that we track people's contributions across time and see when people are committed to a conversation. And there's this interesting thing like the consistency of influence into a particular conversation. We all know, like again, Lady Gaga, Barack Obama have millions of followers, and they may dip into and dip out of conversations, but that may be doing the superfan an injustice, the person who's been tweeting about the brand month after month after month, and maybe only has a couple hundred followers, but is getting lost in the other influence metrics we have available. And finally, extending our understanding of how current influencers became endemic to the network, which is just to say, basically, there are Twitter celebrities, and those people grew up with Twitter, and they grew up within Twitter as well. They're not people who are taking their celebrity into Twitter. And I think this is, both in Twitter, and you can also see it in YouTube as well, these content production networks. If you can come up with a way of looking all the way back and seeing who was influential in Twitter in the first place and grew their influence within Twitter, it's very possible with a full-blown historical set of data. And I'm really intrigued to see if we can identify that list and use that as a predictive measure for finding influencers in the future. Thoughts, sort of, I wanted to get out there. And back over to you, Will.
Thank you very much, Nate. That was really interesting. And I was actually at an event earlier today in London where influencers was coming up a lot again, and it feels like there's a resurgence of interest in that topic. So perhaps we'll dip into that again in a bit. Okay, so let's segue now to Scott, who's a data scientist at Twitter, to give us his perspective on some of the kind of interesting areas and opportunities available with historical data. Over to you, Scott.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to talk a little bit about historical Twitter data. Quickly, I'm going to talk about three main points here. The pattern of analysis that we've found to be a repeated pattern from our internal and external research work that we've been involved with at Twitter on the historical data set. Some things that might be different about the Twitter data than we're accustomed to when we look at the real-time Twitter data, which probably most of you here today are pretty familiar with what happens with real-time Twitter data. Historical has a few differences that you want to be aware of. And then kind of four main strategies for looking at the historical data through mentions, through natural language processing, through looking at networks, and through looking at metadata. So, I mean, don't worry about writing all that down. I actually have a slide at the end that summarizes all that, but that's kind of what I'm going to try to illustrate through some examples of historical data analysis that I've been involved in. So a year ago or so, we decided to ask some questions about South by Southwest. So we started by just pulling some sample data from South by Southwest and looking at the most recent year. And when we did that, we quickly realized that a couple of things were going to happen. One is that South by Southwest is a very localized event on the calendar. But there were some inter-year pieces that were probably going to be interesting, and we were going to want to dig into that. We also realized that once we started to ask the question of what happens around South by Southwest on Twitter, that we were going to want to refine that analysis with some deeper questions about what was happening. So we started out by looking at a mentioned timeline of South by Southwest from 2006 through 2012, and that's what's shown here. Now it's stretched out a lot. Those two lines actually hook together, but they are at a different scale. So the top line has a maximum of about 4,000 tweets per hour mentioning South by Southwest in 2009. And then you can see in 2010, 11, and 12, which is the bottom row there, the scale has actually changed to go up to something like 15,000 tweets per hour. So the first thing we notice here is the growth of the volume on Twitter over time makes analysis of any given event a little bit different than we might have expected. The first event in 2006 almost looks insignificant. 2007, you know, it's a little bump we can see here, and then we see a lot of detail, you know, in 2012. But that's just partly the growth and the plot here, and what we really needed to do was normalize by other measures of who was at South by Southwest, how big was Twitter, some of the context we can get by looking at other historical data around that. So the first difference in historical data you might want to really be aware of is comparing things over year introduces this need to normalize over the years of growth of Twitter, as well as looking at the context of the event. Now, if you look at the growth rate, for example, in the lower timeline there between those 3 years, you see it kind of growing on a rate you might expect to be completely attributable to Twitter's growth. What happens between 2007 and 2008 on the top row there is not really attributable only to Twitter growth, but that's actually a change in the event South by Southwest and how it's appearing on Twitter. So there's two kinds of growth here to be aware of. So that was one thing we learned at looking at lots of historical data at once. The other thing is that we noticed this bump in the mid-year, much smaller than the main event, but still a bump in mid-year that recurs in every sample that we had, or every year that we sampled here. And in that case, what we're finding is the panel picker season was the time when the insiders from South by Southwest promoted the talks they wanted to give. I call them insiders because these were people who wanted to speak or be on a panel at South by Southwest. So the historical run gave us this view into a second piece of conversation around South by Southwest that we didn't expect at the beginning, because there were conversations happening around the panel picker season. So those were a couple of things we found from looking at just the mentioned timelines around South by Southwest. After we looked at the data that we pulled back for this mentioned timeline of South by Southwest, we discovered there were a number of interesting brand conversations. So for example, the peak of the use of Flickr as an image sharing service happened a couple years before the peak of sharing other kinds of videos through YouTube, as an example. Also, the use of Flickr as an image sharing service peaks just before the release of things like Instagram and Pinterest. And you know, by looking at different kinds of questions and asking those questions in different ways of the historical data, we were actually able to see overall trends in the use of image sharing, for example, across this data set. In this next example, shifting gears, we looked at a conference that was run by GNIP earlier this year, and we looked at the interaction graph versus the social graph for that conference. So in that case, the social graph is the graph of who follows whom, and the interaction graph is who mentioned whom or who tweeted with the hashtag referring to someone else, or things that were connected through the actual tweet activity itself versus the follower graph. So on the left in this centrality chart, we have the interaction graph, and on the right in this we have the follower graph. Now, centrality is this idea in graph analysis that we look at who plays the between roles in connecting people. So by a couple of measures, we did some graph analysis here to look at the between roles, and I think it's not too surprising that the GNIP account played a very central role in the GNIP conference for a between role from the follower graph perspective, but that actually there's a number of individuals who play a much more central role in the interaction graph. So for example, Settlinger or Omraduke or Flying Girl 2, ranking at 3, 4, and 5, actually played very central roles in connecting people during the conference through their interactions with people, even though they weren't necessarily the central players in the follower social network graph. So the one thing that this brought up immediately for us is this idea of asking the question better after we looked at this chart. And the question that we asked after this chart was, what does it look like if you compare the interaction graph to the social graph around an event? And then if you were able to do the before and after using historical data, you could actually tell how your event and the interactions at the event changed the follower graph. So here's a chart. There's actually a URL at the bottom there. I encourage you to type that in and explore that web page. If you use that URL, you actually can zoom in and zoom out and see better connection graphics and a little bit more explanation of what's going on here. But I think that the faraway view that I have here, the zoomed out view, really gives you a clear vision of what's happening here, is that the interaction chart and the follower graph, the social network, the one we're more accustomed to thinking about of who follows whom, really look quite different around the event. And we were able to do this before and after and show how the follower graph was changed by the event. So this was about a 3-day event. So this happened fairly quickly. And it gave us a really interesting view into how conferences and interaction among the people changed the follower graph.
Just a quick question there, Scott.
Yes.
So I could feel my brain was feeling quite tickled. It was on the verge of being mind blown. What was the red and the grey representing? So what is this telling us?
Right. So the interaction graph is the above graph, I believe, and the social network is the below graph, and the weight of the lines is the sort of weight of connection.
Okay.
Between the two. So some people mentioned each other a lot. Some people were heavily connected by previous tweets through the follower graph, and then others were connected lightly in a brand new way that they had never been connected to before the conference itself. And okay. I think that's a lot easier to see if you visit the web page there. I encourage you to zoom in there and have a look. I think the main thing you get from this zoomed out view is this sort of sense of change or sense of difference.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, great question. I know we're looking at a far out view of a kind of a complex graph there. And a third kind of analysis that you can do with the historical Twitter data that's just endlessly fascinating is to look at things like geodata by other terms. And in this case, we partnered with the company Mapbox to do some historical data that looked at geodata combined with the device type that someone was tweeting from. And again, I have a URL there because this is an interactive visualization. I have it zoomed in right now in Boulder, Colorado. If you've been to Boulder, Colorado, you can identify Pearl Street, for example, as the angular line there going through the middle of the chart. But what this really shows is that, so this is a map application that has no maps drawn. These are completely drawn by the tweets that are geotagged and by device. So they're colored by device. You can see that Boulder has a fairly heavy iPhone usage along the Pearl Street Mall as well as on the hill around the university, for example, where there might be other pockets of Android use shown in green. This is an example of a kind of data you might not expect to be coming out of historical Twitter, and yet there's a lot of metadata you can correlate with things like languages spoken, location of geotagged tweets, and things like that. So just to summarize here, I tried to pick a couple of stories that illustrated the process we use. So come up with a good question. Hypothesize is kind of a big mouthful, but really just refine the way you ask questions so that they're answerable by the data. Sample, analyze, visualize, and repeat. And I think no matter what kind of system you're using, that pattern seems to apply to historical data. We almost always ask only partially the right question to start with. So having the ability to cycle back after you've analyzed and visualized the data in some way and re-ask the question is really important on historical data. You almost always learn so much that you realize you didn't ask the right question to start with. Years of data introduces some interesting challenges around the change in volume, the change in language use, the change in product names over time. We've run into all of these, and you kind of have to think these through when you're thinking in terms of years of data instead of the real-time stream. And then I've tried to show some examples of mention and frequency counting. I think a lot of people are familiar with topics and sentiment analysis. I showed a couple of kinds of network analysis, both the interactions of people on Twitter as well as the friend-follower graph, and then a little example of metadata. And really, you know, I think the kinds of analysis you can do are up to you to imagine the good questions and imagine how to go after those answers. And I think it's really exciting to be able to dig into that. So thanks a lot. I'll hand it back over to Will.
Thank you very much, Scott. If my brain was feeling gently tickled at the preceding slide, the location stuff was properly mind-blowing. That's fantastic. Very interesting.
It's a great way to burn an entire afternoon looking at maps of the world created by where people tweet from.
Yeah, well, I love the idea of drawing a map from the tweets. That's a really provocative and creative idea, which is cool. Cool. So I think we're starting to kind of play around with some of the themes and opportunities here with historical Twitter data. What would be good, Phil, if I can bring you into the discussion is, you know, putting this in the context of clients. You work with brands every day. All of us here in some way are providing services to organizations. You know, from your point of view, what is the opportunity here? What value do you see when you hear Nate and Scott talking about that stuff?
Yeah, everyone. Beyond, you know, using Twitter historic data for individual brand, you know, trending, how they're doing and such, I think the opportunity to learn about the platform and how it evolved is important. So, you know, looking at, I remember distinctly, you know, back when 9/11 happened, and the PR industry was suffering a lot, you know, as long as everyone else. But what was specific to PR industry was the news hole suddenly diminished. You know, no one is talking about, you know, Coca-Cola 100-year or 200 years anniversary. No one's talking about, you know, the Lego or whatever. There's no news being talked about except the terrorist coverage. And I think by having historic data, we can, you know, what we do for brands every day is they want to access Twitter as their brand voice to engage with consumer or audience. But by understanding you know, and part of it is our ability to tell the customer how the audience is going to react to content. So by having historic data, we can go back to a lot of, you know, past event and glean insight into, you know, the behavior of the audience in that platform during those key social, news, cultural events, you know, election, Super Bowl, you know, even really, you know, big one like, you know, war on terrorists and that kind of stuff.
That was great, thank you. And I just wanted to shift over to Nate and see, Nate, what your perspective is on the kind of use cases or benefits that brands and organizations will be most interested in to begin with.
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess it's starting back from just the idea of getting historical social content. It's always a tricky endeavor because just the very nature of the internet is that you kind of always know you're not getting everything. And I think that there's almost just like this sigh of relief from a research perspective when you go, well, I may not know much, but I know I've got all of it. And so I think from an analysis perspective, there's just something comforting about that, which allows you to kind of be a little bit more bold with the data. Definitely, you know, kicking down the caveats, or there are always caveats with data, but taking out some of those and being able to just sort of run free, I guess, if you will, is always kind of nice. The specific use cases, I think, they're always, a little bit research based, and they can have anything to do with sort of pairing that up with real-time listening in terms of tracking current campaign performance against past campaign performance, especially if you have the same content that you're running again, or you're going through a product relaunch or something like that. It's just nice to be able to benchmark. And then just being able to, coming back from that influencer identification and just sort of getting a real deep feel of the conversation. There's something about being able to just flesh that out with a full deck of historical data, which I like as well. I mean, you just sort of, again, you get that sense of completeness. So
cool. Thank you, Nate.
Yeah.
And I think when I first started exploring this world and learning more about it, the word that I felt like I added a new word to my daily lexicon, which is corpus. And so I guess what we've got here is the ability to access the full Twitter corpus, which is that whole body of work, every tweet that's ever been. And I think Scott, it would be interesting from your experience, like what is the value? You showed us a bit with South by Southwest, but what's the value of being able to go back to 2006 rather than just back to 2013?
Yeah, I think one of the use cases that I have encountered more recently that I hadn't thought of before the interaction I had with the researchers was there's a lot of software applications that are being updated automatically all the time. So many manufacturers of software are pushing security updates and functionality updates to their software regularly, and this happens on your phone as well as on your desktop computer. It kind of feels like every other day you log on, sometimes there's a new update being pushed. What this particular manufacturer of software wanted to learn was, we have a database of how often we push those things and how successfully we think they were installed. We have no sense of the user's reaction to one installation versus another. So they were looking to Twitter to supplement their internal event database, which described very clearly how they had pushed software updates, and correlate that with the reaction on Twitter to the updates that they had pushed. And so they were easy. It made it very easy for them to see the hotspots, and update 1, 2, 3, 4 turns out to have been a problem for people on Android, for example, and they were able to see that immediately, react to that through their customers' relationship management utilities, as well as feed that back into the product system as sort of, why did this affect these customers this way and why was it so frustrating for them?
That's really interesting.
Yeah, and I think without the ability to retroactively ask those questions across history, that was a use case that we were never going to realize.
Scott, I know that some of the projects and initiatives that you guys at Twitter have been involved in haven't just been limited to brands, and you've been thinking about some of the insights that can be gained for organizations that exist for other causes in the world. So, like natural disasters and response to world events. It would be useful to just hear some anecdotes or an example from you about something interesting that people have been doing with historical data in more of a world affairs context.
Sure. There are actually a number of really interesting studies available that you can find where there's some published work. One that I've been involved in most recently has been to look at the evolution of the topics discussed on Twitter following flooding events. And I think around flooding events in particular, because there's a certain reaction time for warnings to go out, like we are in the middle of a flooding situation. There's a set of communications around taking shelter, whether that's official shelters that have been set up or people offering some kinds of help and shelter. And then there are things that take longer to evolve around recovery. And what we're finding in this research is that if we look at how these topics evolve around different floods, whether they're in the United States or in Australia, we've compared different floods, different times, different locations, and we kind of find that it's a similar timing, and that you can kind of predict when the next conversation is going to come up around, let's raise money for relief. Let's communicate more clearly what the damage is so that government agencies can do their work. let's hurry and save what we can right now. We're in the middle of this situation, so all those kinds of topics come up. They come up in about the same order and about the same relative strength, and they actually give you a sense of the whole cadence of how the conversation and the event is unfolding. Including pictures. I mean, you can basically draw a margin around the event just by looking at pictures.
That is really interesting. So what I would like to move on to is for the everyday analyst, so the people here who may not be familiar with R or deep analysis. Just to begin with, if we talk about practical tips for analyzing large sets of data, Nate, where do you practically, having worked with some of these bigger data sets, do you have any sort of tips for the audience?
I guess the tip that I always am tempted to ignore and then usually do to my own peril is just get the data you need. So it feels like it's going counter to what everything we just talked about. But from the perspective of these data sets, and literally in terms of megabytes, and if we're all relying on the tools of the trade like Excel, et cetera, every megabyte counts. It's really tactical, but basically grab the data that you need, grab the metadata that you need, figure out what, and this goes back to Scott's point about the hypothesis too. It's not taking the shotgun approach when you have a deadline is always a tricky proposition. So that would be my one overarching piece of advice is when these things scale, just go for exactly what you think you need to prove or disprove the hypothesis you have. If you're doing large scale research, you can put aside the time for that and it's definitely amazing, but that would be my one big takeaway.
That's a great and empowering tip. I like it for you're scoring highly on practicality there.
I aim to please.
So then let's go to Scott and then Phil. So Scott first, tips for the non-data scientist in working with large sets of data. Someone who would identify as an analyst or analytical, but not at the super number crunching end.
I would echo Nate. I think that's a very wise piece of advice that all of us we get a little bit over greedy with our hunger for the data and sometimes get ourselves into a lot of trouble. So Nate's advice can't be overemphasized. I think along with Nate's advice is this parallel idea of have the patience to iterate. So take a small sample, ask the best question you can, do some analysis, and be ready to repeat. I think we often have a very linear view of how we're going to converge to an answer, which we almost always get talked out of one way or another by the data. I mean, the data kind of speaks a different language once you've started to analyze it. And so the patience or the preparation or the planning to iterate 2 or 3 times, I think, it's more comfortable to work with a bigger team in that way. And also, I think you just get to better answers if you have that patience to refine and iterate.
Cool. I love the idea that the data speaks a different language. I'm going to steal that. Phil, for you, there are often deadlines. Do you get the time to do this kind of deeper analysis? And if so, what's your tip for the audience?
I agree with both of the guys. 100%. Beyond setting goals and objectives ahead of the research, you need to know what you're looking for before you go into look for it. But I also find a lot of times it's important to put context into the data, because when your research come back with a load of data, a lot of times the insight might not be there, or might be there but need some contextual understanding of the nature of things happening back then. For instance, like looking at that iPhone and versus Android Twitter in Boulder, if you go back to 2006 or 2014 or whatnot, you need to put into the context the market share of these two, or of all the devices, so that your understanding, is maybe back then Android, I don't know, Android might have only like a 20% share of the market, and naturally that will lend itself to an understanding of the data.
Cool, that's a really interesting idea. I love that. So we're going to ask some questions of the audience in a second. So if you do have any more questions, we've got a couple already, but please do use the chat box on GoToWebinar or tweet us with #BrandwatchTips. Just a couple of last questions from me to get us ready. Favorite discovery through analyzing historical data, or what would you find out if you could? So Nate, how does that land for you? What's either something that you found working with a client that was really interesting and useful, or what would you really like to go and dig around for?
This is totally not my day job, so but I would love to do epidemiological work with this stuff. So I'd like to look for trends and patterns in people's health, and I think that could be just incredible. Google's done some of that stuff around search, predicting the flu season and such, and I think there's just something extra to add there with social data. So totally not a marketing thing, but also it's like feels like a good contribution of social media to real life too. So
cool. And for you, Scott, what's been something unexpected? I think a lot of the time when we work with data, we know what we're looking for. Have you found counterintuitive or unexpected outcomes in your use of historical Twitter data?
So I think one of my things is a bit of a cheat to the question you asked, but it's an experience I've had more and more the more projects I've gotten to be involved in, and that is this idea that just everything is in Twitter. I think we tend to see stories in the research, academic papers and things, and say, well, sure, that's on Twitter clearly, but what about what I'm interested in? And now that we've had historical data available for a while, and we've had some chances to dig into lots of kinds of questions, the limitation for me to find answers about things on social media are really limited to my creativity in asking the question. And I think I did not realize this initially. And I'm an employee of Twitter and still just didn't realize how many things were covered and how broad the coverage is and how many people are there speaking about whatever they're interested in. So, it's pretty much everything you can imagine, and it's really up to us to think of how to ask the questions.
Great.
So
I love that.
I mean, that's a privileged place to live.
Cool. Okay, good. We've got a question, so I'm going to move on to that. So thank you to Sam, who has asked, how would you approach a client with an idea for a project based on data analysis, or do they tend to come to you? So I think this is about how do we pitch the value and how do we propose in a way that a client's going to find really engaging projects that have this data analysis element to them. So let's go to Phil and then Nate on that one to begin with.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, for me, I always, and it's probably not a good thing to say, but data is kind of like a gateway drug. You have to give some to entice people in some, at times. So what is a good practice sometimes is let's give them some preliminary insight so that they can actually take that insight and understand how that can drive the business decision, how it can inform the strategy, and then then move into a deeper dive. But having that first level of data to start the conversation, I found very helpful.
I love that. Cool. And for you, Nate?
I guess it's so 3 tricks that I would use, not tricks, because that sounds like I'm trying to fake you out so that you'll accidentally use data or something.
Come on, guys. We can't describe historical data in these terms. First, we've got a gateway drug, and now we've got tricks.
Yeah. Okay. No,
Let's get back to that. Ethical, moral high ground.
Yeah. Well, I think 3 things. That one is lead with the value. I mean, lead with the value of the data, and the way that you lead with the value of the data is the data leads you to a story, and that's really important because a story is a way that you're going to actually come from a set of facts and go into an action to take. And then there's a flip side to that too, which is you can tell a wonderful story with no data as well, and people tell great stories all the time with no data, and they're effective for marketing purposes, and they're just lovely to read. But the nice thing about having data is that it supports that and supports your day job. So the other thing that I'll always try to say is, if you're using data to tell a story and it's interfering with your day job, then we have to fix how we're working with that data. And it's possible to do it, but that's usually the pain points that I find when people are trying to work with data, when they're either used to telling stories without it and they can do it well already, or they're just have some hesitancy. So
cool. Another question here from Johan. Let's start with you on this one, Scott. What other data could you combine with historical Twitter data for greater insights? So Scott, in your presentation, you touched on location, for example. Are there other examples you've been tempted to play with, or you actually have, where you've mashed other data sets with the Twitter?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think so. There are two broad opportunities here. For example, to hook up user information. So one strategy we've seen used very effectively is that consumers of Twitter data will also get permission from their customers to join Twitter data to their internal business data. So one large opportunity is to join your internal business data to the Twitter stream in a broad way, so that you can see the broad trend of all of your own customers and how they use Twitter. And that can be both, a customer relationship tool for looking how they talk about your products and services, but more broadly, it can also tell you what else are these people interested in. So the key there is some text mining to find out what else these people are up to that might be pertinent to your business or your relationship to them. So that can be a large opportunity. And then in terms of external data sets, we've done many projects where we've used Twitter geo information and sometimes topics that are derived from Twitter text, body text, to match up with things like broader demographics around county or city level data that we can get through open government, for example. Also a large opportunity to understand your audience better.
Scott, cool. I had a quick question, actually. Is that all right?
Go for it.
Awesome. I was curious, the Twitter data that you had for Boulder, Colorado, I mean, with census data overlaid that, it seems like you could start to build these like literal demographics of device usage and all this other stuff from scratch. Is that something that you've sort of taken a look at yet, or I'm just curious if there's anything that's peaked there?
Yes, I mean, we have done things like that. I think in terms of the iPhone Android comparison, for example, you do find some demographic patterns that are reflected over and over, especially in large cities. So, for example, that can be very telling about sort of who's choosing Android over iPhone and what other environmental factors come into play there. I think that getting your imagination is sort of just touching the tip of the iceberg in many ways. There are so many other kinds of data in addition to economic data to add to these sets by location that there are questions you can ask about how tweeting is related to interest in certain kinds of hobbies, products, sporting events. There's actually a broad range of questions that we've been able to get at with external data sets here.
Great stuff. The one example that stands out for me was hearing a very famous American retailer talking about how they have been using historical tweets, matching that with customer records in their CRM, and starting to develop a more like the promise of social CRM. So looking at the interests and matching that with the buyer behavior on a one-to-one kind of customer basis. And as a marketer, that's the stuff that gets me really excited. So I'll just throw that one in there. One other question we've got here from Jethro is, what is the best way to break down the data to understand trends, traffic, and engagement? And there's a second part to the question, which is, can this presentation and slides be emailed over with the Q&As? So the answer to the second part is, absolutely, we send out the slides and a recording within a few days, so that will be coming your way. But with the first part of the question, Phil, what's the best way to break this stuff down so that you're actually understanding the trends and traffic and engagement, as Jethro's put it?
I think for me as a data person, I break it down to the smallest denominator first, to understand very very granularly what is going on. But I think to share back with the client, that really depends on the context in where in what they need to understand. If it is a crisis situation, for instance, and it happens in a duration of 2 weeks, I would suggest packaging it back into that incident, and look at the data as a whole that way.
Okay, cool. And either of Scott or Nate got anything to chip in there?
Well, I think the trends question in particular sort of points to some of the challenges of historical data. I mean, it also points to the opportunities, but I showed the South by Southwest example with what I sort of asserted were two kinds of trends. One trend was the growth of Twitter. The other trend was the change in the way South by Southwest and the participants there had embraced Twitter as one of the key tools for communication. And I think sorting out those two kinds of trends becomes, you have to be more and more careful about that as you pull in more and more historical data. And I think this kind of goes back to Nate's point, is you might want to start with a small sample in a time window that you can deal with the trend information constructively, and then expand out from there with better questions.
That's great. So we're going to do one more Q question, and then we're going to wrap up. So we've got a question here, which is from Natalie. When is it best to analyze the entire data set as opposed to a sample? That's kind of what you just answered, I think, Scott. Is there a different take on that, Nate? So when is it best? When would you go for everything as opposed to a sample, or would you just actually never do that?
If I was trying to build a list of things, specifically around content or influence, I'd probably go for everything. Because I'm just going for a really simple list, and I want to make sure I don't miss anybody off the list, or I don't miss any kind of content off the list, or a link, or whatever it is, or hashtag, etc. I mean, hashtags is actually different. So if I'm going for, I guess the distinction is, I'll try to make, if I can, yikes, is that it's the unique things. So if you're going for a list of unique things, like a unique list of people, go for everything, because you may get one person who's put one tweet out there, for instance, and you may want to pull them up. If you're going for volume, trends, etc., I think it's perfectly reasonable to sample. So in that case, that's why I sort of stopped myself on the hashtags thing. Was, if you're looking for a unique list of hashtags being included in the conversation, by all means grab everything. But if you're looking for just merely a ranking of those, then you can by all means sample away, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And guys, anyone got any last kind of additions to that question before we wrap up?
Yeah, I think it's actually useful to remember you have two kinds of sampling available. With historical data, you have the idea of sampling a time period you understand. So let's look at 5 days during South by Southwest versus 5 days not during South by Southwest and make a simple comparison. That's a windowing type sample. And then you also have the opportunity to sample with a statistical operator that says, please deliver only 10% of the data randomly chosen. Both of those can be effective. Obviously, they're better at answering different kinds of questions, but it's sometimes useful to be creative with the kind of sampling you do.
Okay, we've just got another question in. Hold on to your horses, guys. We've got another one. So from Tyler, there are actually two parts to this, so I'll read it out and then I'll replay it. So the first part is, any best practice tips for targeting, collecting, and analyzing data from influencers, and how can we leverage this data into results for a client? And then there's a technical question, which is there a way to better identify influencers with the platform, i.e. limit searches to users with 1,000+ followers? So the last bit feels relevant to Nate most especially, although I imagine Phil also knows how to answer that, being a heavy Brandwatch user. But let's take it in two parts. So the first bit is, any best practice tips for targeting, collecting, and analyzing data from influencers, and how can we leverage that data into results for a client? So let's start with you, Phil.
I think it's important to know um, what the whole conversation from influencers. I think a lot of times, especially for in the PR world, we looked at influencers and only looked at the branded conversation and go, oh, this person talk about my brand a lot, or not enough. But you have to kind of put into context, well, comparing to other branded conversation of other company, how is this person a advocate, or is it just a very evenly distributed conversation among all the competitors?
Great. And Nate, if we could ask you, so is there a way within Brandwatch to better identify influencers? So that it says, i.e., limits searches to users with 1,000+ followers. But bonus points if you cover clout, because someone else has just come in and asked about that too.
If I cover cloud.
Yeah. No,
Yeah. So, well, yeah, certainly like taking advantage of all the filters on the right-hand rail or on top of a dashboard is a pretty nice place to start. I actually have had a lot of success with like cross-channel influence in the app with the impact score. And it's a little bit of a black box. So, there's that classic. So there's my reference to clout. You got a little bit of a black box with cloud too, but those have their uses. I mean, with those things, it's more like a trust basis. Like, is it giving me good results? And then you can, because it's always the methodology is always the same for calculating it, you can expect a bit of consistency in the quality of those results. Usually, sometimes that's actually a really horrifically dangerous thing to say. So forget I said it, but you can, but the impact score is something that I've found really useful. You throw a rule up on it for like a cutoff of like 60 or 70. It's normalized in your conversation from 0 to 100. So for your particular query, and then just go ahead and write a rule for it and see what kind of content streams through, and that's pretty useful too. I think there's a second layer outside of. The way I would also think about it is there are engagement metrics. So there's actual conversational back and forth. That can be commenting on blogs, that can be retweets, that can be other actual activity like that, which is trackable. And then there are your sort of more static stats like followership and a blog viewership and stuff like that. So sometimes it's helpful to segment those out too and consider two different sets of influence measures and the two different lists those might produce.
Great. Cool. Well, we're going to wrap up now because it's coming to the end of the allocated time. We like to finish on time or ahead of time, and I would like to start by thanking the audience for their attention. We really appreciate it. As I mentioned before, the slides and a recording will be mailed to you in the next few days. If you find that useful, look out for it. And I'd also like to thank Phil Cam from Text100, Scott Hendrickson from Twitter, and our very own Nate Walton from Brandwatch. So thank you very much, and feel free to ask further questions on the hashtag, and we look forward to seeing you in the future. Bye-bye.